Welcome to HSM Specials. Today we are with Adrian Slowatsky, partner of Oliver Wyman, one of the top consulting firms in the world, and the author of The Profit Zone and other books specialized in dealing with profits and how to increase profits and to deal with profits and growth. Thank you, Adrian, for being with us.
My pleasure, Edward.
What is profits? What is profitability? How would you define it?
Well, it's a great question because I often ask people and I sometimes get some funny answers. An airline executive said profitability is something we haven't seen for several years. Someone else said that profitability is a measure of how smart we really are about our business. But I think for many companies, the fundamental answer is profitability equals resources to reinvest in the business. If profitability is very low, the ability to invest to create new value for customers and to reinvest in the employees is low or not existent. If we can create profitability that's very high, we have the resources to invest in innovation, to create new value for our customers, and to improve the training and the capabilities of our employees. So that it's a financial measure for sure, but its strategic significance is the high profit companies have the best resources to reinvest, to protect and grow their position.
But what if I say profits are the money to give back to the shareholders? Isn't that also true?
Oh, it absolutely is, because some part of profitability you give as dividends. But most owners of equity are investing not for the dividend, they're investing for growth. They're investing to protect that profitability and to grow that profit over time. And so the high profit companies certainly have the ability to give an appropriate dividend to the investor. But what the investor is really interested in is, if the stock price is 20 today, how can you make it 50 to 100? And the high profit companies have the best capability to reinvest to make that happen.
And how can you take a stock from 50 to 100? What are the key drivers of profitability?
The key drivers of profitability begin, oddly enough, outside in with the customer. Do I have the right customer selection so that I serve people that I can win with, and I don't have a confused customer set where I do poorly with others? And do I have a unique value proposition so that I am their number one choice? That's half the equation.
Give me an example of those two things.
In the consumer electronics world, as you know, there was something very famous called the Walkman.
Yes.
Then there was the Discman. But the company who should have taken the next step wasn't Sony, it was somebody else, namely Apple, that figured out that the new consumer wanted to be able to download music digitally and to be able to buy music legally at an appropriate price. And Apple created the iPod system, the iTunes music store, and the alliance with the music producers to provide that whole combination of features to the consumer. That became the consumer's number one choice, and today Apple and the iPod have something like 70 to 75% of the market. They became the customer's first choice. That's half the equation. The other half of the equation is to have the right cost structure and pricing system to convert the value that you've created for the customer into value for the shareholder. And Apple has operated on both levels there. Number one, on the cost, they have very carefully outsourced components so that they just assemble at an ultra low cost the ultimate device. As importantly, on the pricing side, they've been very innovative about reversing the traditional razor and razor blade model. In the traditional model, you sell the razor for a low price to sell razor blades. Apple, in a very creative way, sells the music for a very low price in order to be able to sell its high margin devices. So they're the first choice of the customer. They are also extraordinarily profitable and have the kind of high margins and growth that the investors absolutely love. And it was an opportunity that was available to several other players. Apple understood the customer better, moved more quickly, worked on the value proposition side and on the economic side, and is a great example of how you need to put several components of the puzzle together in order to make it work.
Let's translate that for a hypothetical Mr. Brown, the owner of a furniture business. How does he organize his company, his team, on one side to select customer and value for customers, and the other for this business model, business design?
Very, very fair. I think the point of departure is, what customer is Mr. Brown's company serving? Are they serving the luxury customer? Are they serving the mid-market customer or the low-price customer? Because the requirements of those customers are very, very different, and you can't use the same business model for all three. If I'm serving the luxury customer, my costs are important, but they may not be as important as my service, my design, my presentation, and my customer relationship management. If I am serving the low-price customer, I absolutely must have the ultra-low-cost position, and I must carefully understand what are the services the customer really wants and will pay for, and what will they not pay for, so that I get my economics right. So I have to start with the outside. Who am I serving? How do I get to be their number one choice? And then how do I build the economics to be successful with them? And the answer is extraordinarily different for the luxury buyer versus the low-cost buyer versus the middle market buyer.
You studied a lot how to manage risk and the implications of risk, information and risk, and said a while ago that risk is an expensive substitute for information. What does that mean?
It becomes most clear in the world of understanding how the customer changes. For better or for worse, customers always changed, but today they are changing much more quickly than before. What they want, what they will pay for, what their preferences are, what their dislikes are. And also they are becoming more complicated in the sense of, there used to be 2 or 3 major segments in a market. Today there will often be 15 or 20 different segments in the market, where some want luxury, some want low price, some want a different combination of things. Companies get frequently blindsided by changes in what customers want. It happens in technology, it happens in financial services, it happens in retailing. Several companies, such as Coach in luxury leather goods, such as Capital One in credit cards, such as Harrah's in casinos and gaming, such as Tsutaya in Japan in video and book distribution, have discovered that the only way to get ahead of that is to have unique systems to capture proprietary information about the customer, connect it to their organization, and apply it more quickly than anybody else. As a result, these companies tend to do much more customer homework than their competitors. Okay. Coach does 60,000 customer interviews a year because they want to be the first to know if the customer wants black versus red, or turquoise versus aquamarine.
Say that again. How many thousand?
60,000 customer interviews a year to find out what they're satisfied with, intent to buy, validated intent to buy, what their price sensitivity is. They do 10 times more than their competitors. Capital One in the credit card market does 60,000 in-market experiments a year. It is very hard for the customer to surprise Coach or Capital One or Harrah's.
That's definitely something Mr. Brown on the furniture business has to do. Constantly report, interview the customer's desires. And
absolutely correct. And it is something that prevents you from being surprised. It prevents you from being hurt by unexpected risks. But it has a flip side. It will always be your biggest growth opportunity, because you will be the first to detect changes in taste, changes in style, changes in preference. And if that happens, you have the best lead time to develop either the new products or the variations or the services that are the best for segment A versus segment B versus segment C. And in many cases, you will be the first to see an entirely new segment emerging before the competition.
The impact on the organizational design. Up to now, sales does a lot of, collecting the customer's voice, marketing a lot of that, but their main goal are different. Yes. Do you believe in having a customer director, a customer function only to have the voice and not necessarily the implications on product or sales?
It's a very tough question, a very good question, and my short answer would be yes, because I think that the greatest difficulty in really finding out about the customer is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so if I'm the marketer, there are certain things I'm looking for. If I'm the salesperson, there are certain things that I'm looking for, versus someone who is neutral, objective, and is trying to really understand what that change is, number one. Number two, for this to be really effective, it has to be translated into what the organization does. So for example, that information that Coach collects directly impacts what the designers do, the fabrics they choose and the products they develop. At Harrah's, that feedback from the customer determines the training programs that they provide to their employees and how they score them on service to the customer. That function goes beyond what it's reasonable to ask a marketing person or a salesperson to do, but someone who is responsible for collecting that data can provide valuable insights to marketing and sales, but at the same time provides valuable insights into how we have to design differently, how we have to train our people differently, how do we have to provide our service differently.
You mentioned the misperceptions. You also talk about the laws of perceptions. What are those laws?
Well, there are two or three important ones. The first is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. We see them through the filter of our successful business design, and the last thing we want to know is that we have to change something. So the second law is, when we do ask or try to find out what's different about the customer, we shouldn't go in with an attitude of what do I need to know, but rather with the attitude of what am I afraid to find out. Because that's the most valuable information. That gets me ahead of the risk rather than behind the risk. And the third and the toughest is, if we are phenomenally successful at one business model, we often see least the things that we need to see the most. It was very hard for Barnes & Noble to see the importance of Amazon. It was very hard for Blockbuster to see the importance of Netflix. It was very hard for Sony to see the importance of the iPod. Why? I can't tell you, but it is that law of perception, and it has literally, in the last 15 years, happened dozens of times.
Do you have any ways of avoiding that?
I think that there are some that we underutilize and don't take advantage of. If I run a very successful business, usually the person who can see my risks most clearly is someone outside my business. Someone like the customer, someone like a supplier, someone like a venture capitalist who is investing in my domain. Because I am so focused on running a successful business, and that's a good thing to do, that it may be more difficult for me to see the risks to my business than for any outsider. It's as if, if I had a blemish on my forehead, speaking to 100 people, everybody would see the blemish except for me. Okay. That's how it works.
When you talk about risks, I think of the downside. But is there a way of making money with the risks?
That was the biggest surprise in the research that we did on strategic risk management. For reasons that it's difficult to explain, unlike hazard risks like fires or earthquakes or operating risks, the plant breaks down, strategic risks, if they are seen early and if the company reacts proactively, turn out to be a highly unconventional but very effective way to find your biggest growth opportunity.
For example?
For example, when Microsoft in 1995 was threatened by the internet, which threatened the relevance of their desktop business, Bill Gates turned around and said, we have to put the internet into everything we do, and they had their 5 greatest years of growth as a result. In contrast, Barnes & Noble didn't double bet against Amazon, and 7 years later, Amazon is worth $30 billion, Barnes & Noble is worth $2.5 billion, and much of that $30 billion could have gone to Barnes & Noble if they had acted early. A third example is for Samsung in 1998, one of their biggest risks was brand risk. They were known as the company of cheap microwaves and cheap TVs. Jung Young Yoon, the CEO of Samsung, took that problem head on, made a series of very tough and courageous decisions, including making the engineers subordinate to the designers, including recalling old products even before the new ones were ready, including changing distribution channels and moving out of Walmart to Best Buy and Circuit City. And as a result, he turned that risk around into an enormous opportunity. The brand value of Samsung tripled in the next 6 years after he made those decisions. So for strategic risks, if a management team sees them early and is proactive, they can transform that risk into a growth opportunity.
Interesting. Those are success stories because Samsung was in the low end. They could have stayed in the low end and be the leader of electronics in the low end. But they jumped to the high end with success, as you say. Do you have examples of companies that have continued in the low end with success and that's also appropriate? And what's the impact or the implications for Mr. Brown? Do you have to systematically go for the high end? Is there the money, or you can make money at the bottom of the pyramid?
Great question. And let's go back to the Samsung example, because I think there was a tough question of if they had stayed in the low end, could they have been successful?
Yes.
In that particular case, if you step back and look at consumer electronics, which is the game they were in, that was a business that had 10 to 12% margins in the mid-90s, and it's now down to 2% or 1% today. Samsung may not have been able to be successful at the low end because customer power was so great from the big retailers, and because new Asian competitors had extraordinarily low costs, for example, Apex versus Sony, that they may not have been successful, and the move up was perhaps the only move they could make.
Okay.
In many other industries, however, you can be very successful at the low end. And to think of Mr. Brown and the furniture business, there is a very, very big market there, but you may have to develop a radically different business model to succeed. Case in point, IKEA is phenomenally successful at extremely low price points. But look at the business design that they have built. They've built a network of suppliers that are ultra low cost. They have built a logistical system that is extremely low cost. They have the customers come to their store and take furniture that needs to be assembled at home by the customer. So they have built a fantastic business in furniture at the low end, but with a very different business design than the traditional models.
Yeah, with IKEA, you build your own furniture and you're happy about it, and they save the money of the
Precisely.
labor cost.
So you can absolutely be successful at the low end. Unilever is doing it with India. Bharti is doing it in telecommunications. But you have to ask the question, what is it that the customer wants and will pay for?
Yes.
And how do I create both an economic structure and a pricing structure that makes it possible to be profitable? And in certain domains, low-cost consumer electronics, it may not be possible. There are domains in the economy, airlines is one, consumer electronics is another, that are no profit zones. Memory chips for most players are no profit zones. So you have to step back and ask the fundamental question, will any supplier be allowed to make money in this industry? And if so, what's the specific business design that I have to build that makes it customer's number one choice, but with the economics to create profitability because of cost position and pricing power?
You talk, and you mentioned it indirectly, a little bit about value migration and value collapse. What is it? What are the lessons there?
Value migration is a process that happens when value or market capitalization moves from old business designs to new business models, new business designs that do a better job for the customer. It has happened across dozens of industries, from mainframe and mini computer hardware to software, from department stores to discounters, from integrated manufacturers to specialists. When customer priorities change and when industry economics change, unless I reinvent my business design to match the new market and economic reality, I can easily lose 80 to 90% of the value that I've created. And this has happened to dozens of companies, many of the world's leading companies, over the last 20 years. Case example, Sony was worth $130 billion in 1999. It's down to $55 billion today. At the same time, Apple, during precisely the same period, has moved from being worth $10 billion to being worth $120 billion. That, in a nutshell, is value migration, value moving from old business models to new. The collapse that happens to the old business model isn't necessary if you anticipate that shift and start changing your business model early enough to respond. The biggest example, IBM, lost tremendous value in the late 80s and 90s because value moved away from hardware towards software and chips. IBM saw how fundamentally the customers changed. They changed their business design from hardware-centric to services and solution-centric. And after having gone from 140 to 40 billion in value, they are now back up to 120 billion.
You're taking examples of the past. If we take current examples, companies that are at the summit, like Microsoft and Google, do you see in any of those a risk of value collapse?
Oh, they absolutely have to worry about it. And in fact, you picked two great examples because Microsoft is probably 3 to 4 years behind in responding to the Google business model. And they're working very hard now, both in R&D and in thinking about things like the Yahoo merger to respond to that. So they recognize it. We'll see in the next year or two whether they develop an answer. Google itself is in a very, very good position, but when you're most successful, that's the time to start worrying about value migration. Google has done a terrific job in building a superior search engine, but even more importantly, building a profit model to pay for it with advertising that is highly specific. But it's not the only game in town. Others are starting to invent that game. Others are starting to offer to advertisers more specificity and more continuity. And if Google stays with its current business model for the next 3 years, expect its value to fall.
Wow. You mentioned a Greek poet as an example of what we should be doing, Philostratus.
Yes.
What did he say?
What he said was that the gods can see the future, the common man cannot, but the wise man can anticipate what is about to happen. We cannot predict the future. I don't know of anybody who can. But managing strategic risks is not about predicting the future. It is about understanding the kinds of threats that can destroy value. It is about, as the customer information companies like Coach and Capital One do, understanding what we can measure to get the early warning signals. And it is being able to anticipate just a little bit sooner than the others what shift is occurring. What Philostratus didn't say, and is most important for Mr. Brown at the furniture factory or any businessman, whether running a $10 billion company or a $10 million small business, is the important thing about anticipation is to be in a position to react quickly. And when we see value migration happen, the biggest tragedy is when it takes companies 2 to 3 to 4 years to react. You don't have to have a crystal ball, but you do have to worry about the right things, look for the right shifts in the customer, and be able to respond very, very quickly. And Microsoft provides a great example. Steven Sinofsky came back from Cornell in the middle of '94, and within 12 months, the whole direction of Microsoft changed in order to respond to the internet.
Adrian, thank you very much for being with us.
Eduardo, a pleasure. Thank you.